All right, welcome everybody to the first live learning session for this year for 2026. Super excited to be bringing a live learning session to you all about approach to pedagogy, designing for engagement and agency. We've got some awesome guests with us today and super excited to have this conversation. Just a couple of key points to note. The session is being recorded, of course, so being aware of that. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're gathering from today. We're based in Brisbane, Meanjin, our Office of Future Anything, and I'd like to acknowledge the Yoga and Turrbal people of this land. But of course, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where you are all joining us from this afternoon. So I'd love for you to jump into the chat and let us know where you are joining us from, what are the lands from where you are based, and introduce yourself through the chat. That would be really fantastic. We want you to engage with us today. We want you asking questions. We want you to share your comments. Tell us what you liked. Tell us what has landed. If there's a resource or something else that you hear about today, we'd love to know what that is too. This session is all about engagement and agency and how we design learning that's intentional and strategic. Nick's going to provide an overview of the Future Anything approach to pedagogy, which we're very excited about. And then we're going to hear from two schools that work with us around their experiences with working with pedagogy as well. So whether you're jumping in today to listen to some case studies, whether you're refining your model, whether you're looking for somewhere to start, we hope that you're going to find something really interesting from our chat for today. Before we get started, as I see your the places you're joining from around the country coming through the chat right now, I want you to stay in the chat. And I would love to know, what do you think is the biggest challenge right now when you're designing for agency and engagement? You know, is it lack of clarity or a lack of direction? Is it time? Is it consistency? Is it student engagement, or maybe buy-in from staff? So I'd love to know. Throw it in the chat. What's the biggest challenge right now for your learning design? All right, while you're doing that, let's jump straight into it, and I'm going to introduce you to our guests. Of course, we've got our founder and CEO, Nicole Dyson, joining us this afternoon. Super excited to have Nick with me today. We also have Adam Boone, Assistant Head of Secondary Academic Performance at Brisbane Boys College. Really excited to have Adam with us. And a huge welcome to Julie Ferguson, Principal of Marryatville High School in South Australia. So great for Julie to be with us as well. So I don't want to do the whole bio read for you, Adam and Julie. What I'm going to do is just ask you to introduce yourself a little bit, give us a quick snapshot of who you are. And I'm actually wondering if you could share maybe a moment or an experience or a realization that reinforced for you why pedagogy, agency, and engagement is so important and truly matters for young people. Can I throw to you first, Julie? Introduce yourself for us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Ferguson, as you said, Principal of Marryatville High School. We are one of the largest public schools in South Australia. We are probably in the leafy green suburbs, so we're very privileged to have a high socio-economic demographic that come to our school. So our job is obviously to value add to that luxury that we have. We are high performing in terms of academics, but we have a special interest music and tennis program. And we also have a large international program, which brings a really rich and beautiful cultural element to our school. We're lucky enough to have, a really positive student and staff culture. Our goodwill bucket at Marryatville is very deep, so we have lots of staff prepared to stand up and lead. And we have a really strong commitment to student voice and to belonging and to creating a culture, particularly in a large school of 1,750, creating a sense of connection and belonging is really important here. So In terms of a moment that reinforced why pedagogy and agency matter, recently I was lucky enough to travel with about 100 of our music students to Generations in Jazz in Mount Gambier, and it's kind of like the Hogwarts Triwizard Tournament, but for music nerds. And what I noticed and saw, there's 5,000 of them that come and gather from across the country, and they perform with passion and confidence and ownership. There's so much evidence of collaboration and joy in what they're doing. And I guess for me, that's a really powerful reminder that, our young people thrive when their learning is meaningful and it's purposeful and it's connected to who they are and what they believe is really important for them. So that's my little speck of gold.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, Julie. I love that. And it's another perfect example of how learning happens in all areas, all parts of curriculum. I love that. Let's jump to you, Adam. Can you introduce yourself? And same question, any moment or experience that's reinforced pedagogy for you?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Boone. I'm the Assistant Head of Secondary at Brisbane Boys College. In a similar, context to Julie there, we're a sort of a high-performing independent school with a higher socioeconomic student body. And my focus area is around academic performance and sort of supporting and leading student learning and academic growth across the secondary school, and assist in leading initiatives that support academic growth and academic performance, I guess. But not really a moment, but more of a realization, I think, for me, is something I've been grappling with in the last few years, is around just how easy it is at the moment for students to become dependent learners and reliant on teacher and the educator in the classroom. And in many ways, I think, society at the moment is so instant. Everything's at the click of a button. The work in AI that's going on, knowledge is so readily available to students. And I think unintentionally that's probably had an impact on how students approach their learning. And I'm sure, as we all know, that, learning isn't supposed to be passive, it's supposed to be active, and it requires students to sit and struggle at times, to be persistent, and, as Julie said, ensure that it's connected and there's reflection and some sort of element of curiosity there as well. So I think we as educators have a responsibility not just to deliver content but also, I guess, intentionally develop learners who think independently, who can persevere, and who are ready to exit year 12 and enter a world that is just constantly changing. So that's where I see it.
Thank you, Adam. Love that. And look, for those of you that have just joined us, we'd love for you to engage in the chat this afternoon. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask us, the session unpacks, please add it to the chat. We've had a bunch of people let us know where they're joining from, and a couple of different things mentioned around what gets in the way of agency and engagement. So please keep that coming through. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. I won't ask Nick to do a full intro, but of course, I'll throw now to our CEO and founder, Nicole Dyson. We're super excited at Future Anything to have an approach to pedagogy, which hopefully you've heard a little bit about. So Nick's going to unpack it a little bit further.
Thanks, Dan. Dan knows that one of my greatest fears is a bio read, so I won't read a bio, but it's really awesome to see so many familiar faces in the room. I know these things are really often like passive consumptions of knowledge, and I'm super happy for you to sit back with a drink of choice in a mug and chill and watch. And also, if you've got like a curly question, please do jump in and ask it. And so see the chat as an opportunity to kind of throw those questions in, and we will definitely be responsive to them as we're going. And what I'm going to do is like set just a little bit of foundations for the conversation, and then hopefully open up some space for Julie and Adam to share a little bit more about their context and how they've applied their approaches to pedagogy in their work. So Dan told me 10 minutes, and anybody who knows me knows I'm really bad on timing because I get excited about the content, and so then I end up taking longer than 10 minutes. I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to give myself 11 because then it's 4:20 Brisbane time. So let's see how I go. But do please throw questions into the chat, and I'll do my best to kind of respond to those as we're going. I think the first thing that I want to talk about is, the idea of like teaching and learning frameworks or pedagogical frameworks or approach to pedagogies or whatever we want to name them, these frameworks that kind of capture the essence of what teaching and learning looks like in classrooms. This isn't new, okay? Departments have them, systems have them, schools have them. This work is not new work. Potentially what I want to throw forward is that this work has never been more important than now, in the sense that I would say in a post-COVID landscape, we have what I would call like an engagement epidemic. We have a generation of young people and community that are starting to withdraw from education. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for this, right? And we can blame AI and we can blame technology and blame the fact that sometimes I think our students want to swipe up on us when we're teaching in the classroom and just skip this piece of content in favor of something more engaging. But we have a generation of young people, whether you're in a leafy green school or not, whose engagement, the way that they engage with learning has shifted significantly. And so I would say that there's probably three significant things that we need to consider in the way that we construct learning in classrooms. And one of those is pedagogy, like the how of the teaching in the classroom. I think one of them is the why, the relevance of the curriculum that we're delivering in the classroom. That's a second component, so the why and the how. And I think we've also got this element of the what, which is the structure of how we create learning in a classroom. I think if you expect that you can walk into a classroom now and stand and deliver for 60 minutes and have students stay tapped in and engaged in that kind of system of delivery, I think you're kidding yourself. Even if you work in a school where you have highly compliant learners, they are passively engaging in that information. They're not truly tapped in to that piece. And so I think this is where it gets curious for schools and systems to look at. When we're looking at an approach to pedagogy, we have to be looking at engagement as the key driver for the design of that approach to pedagogy. And so when we talk about the value of this work, we're talking about who are your learners in your school community? What do you see in your classrooms? And how can you build a whole school approach that's actually going to magnify the engagement and the relevance for learners that are in the space that you're working in? I'm just going to share a few slides while I walk through this just to kind of help. And I'm happy to make these slides obviously available to everybody. And this session is recorded. So if you love it so much that you want to listen to me all over again later, you will have the joy of doing so. But this notion of like an engagement epidemic, and Dan and I have been presenting some of this data from a US report that's actually measured engagement of young people across 25,000 students in the US from year 3 to year 12. And look, for those that have been in education for a while, you'd know that this dip in engagement is not new information. Okay, we've seen reports like this presented continuously over the last 4 and 5 decades of education, but we really see this huge dip, particularly in that year 7 to year 8 juncture. And I certainly hear teachers talking today about how year 8 is the new year 9 with year 7s being introduced into high school. But what we're seeing is this trending down of engagement. And this also happens across attendance. Okay, so even the latest release of what attendance data is doing in Australia, even if you're working within a high ICSIA school, you're still seeing a reduction in attendance of students, irrespective of your school community. And so this is the data across the attendance level of students based on their ICSIA cohort, like in the time series. So this trending down, although in a post-COVID world, we've seen a small bump up, but it still hasn't reached post-COVID rates of attendance since then. So I guess what I want to introduce is the purpose of pedagogy in my mind is to bridge the gap that exists between the expectations of the teacher and the needs of the young person. Okay, this is the purpose of pedagogy. That how is to bridge the gap between those two things. And look, the challenge at the moment in this landscape that we have in Australia is we have what I would say a very politicized landscape when it comes to pedagogical approaches. There's very much this polarization of what kind of pedagogy we should be using. And most commonly at the moment, the two pedagogies that are put in, polar opposite of each other is this science of learning and this inquiry and project-based learning approach. And I guess what I want to start with is that for us, it's really like, why can't we have both? Okay, it's this notion that the best pedagogy to approach is the pedagogy that's most appropriate for the learners within the context that you're working in. And so you'll see us use this language a lot around pedagogy for purpose, okay, which means the approach to pedagogy that works for one school context, and you're going to hear the work that Julie does and the work that Adam do in their school context, I want to name the fact that what they're doing in their school context is not going to be directly applicable within your school context. And so I'd really encourage you, as you're listening to their experiences, to look at the mechanics around the designs of their approach to pedagogies and how they've engaged communities within a process, and not get caught up in their product, because your school's approach to pedagogy should reflect the needs of your community and the purpose of learning within your community. Now, approaches to pedagogy and teaching and learning frameworks are all like super pretty, right? Like they've got to be, colorful and highly engaging. And like we see this, structured approach to them. But what I want to step through before I close is what we see as some of the fundamental components within the design of an approach to pedagogy. And so we see this occurring, and when we work with schools, we build out this series of artifacts in designing an approach to pedagogy. And so most schools will have a philosophy of education, which is the approach to education that the school subscribes to. But from there, we move into really refining what the inner core components of the school's approach to learning is. And when I say inner core, these are the human qualities that the school values in a graduate. So consider this, like, who are your young people becoming? And then those attributes become the inner core qualities that you're working towards. From there, we look at the outer core. Now, inner core is very contextual to the school community, because the inner core qualities of one school are going to be very different to the inner core graduate qualities of another school. From there, we look at an outer core. And so outer core for us are the transferable capabilities that wrap around those human attributes that sit at the center. Now, those of you that are familiar with our work will know that we have a capability framework, and I'll share a little bit more about that. But what we're talking about here are these 21st century skills or general capabilities that are agnostic to curriculum and context, that enable a learner to move from learning into living in the real world. And so they're the transferable capabilities or skills. From that outer core, once we've refined who our learners are becoming and the transferable skills, the what that we want them to know, we then work with schools to develop their pedagogical drivers, or the pillars that define the essence of what teaching and learning looks like in their classrooms. This is basically, if I was to say, tell me what teaching and learning should look like in your classrooms, these will be the pedagogical drivers that define the type of teaching and learning that you value within your school. Now, once you've got those pedagogical drivers, we then distill those drivers down into signature practice toolkits. And these are the things that then teachers can pick up and use in order to build confidence and capacity to deliver on the promise of those drivers or signature practice in classrooms. And so Adam will share a little bit of how he's working with working parties within his school to build these collective toolkits in the work that they're doing at BBC. Now, if you've seen our very exciting new website that's been about 27 years in the making, I definitely exaggerated, but it's felt like 27 years that it's taken us to build it. You'll notice that there's a pedagogy page there where we've actually started to capture our work, which includes our capability framework, and it also includes the Future Anything approach to pedagogy. And so those of you that are familiar with our work will know that we've always talked about how we sit at the intersection of human-centered design thinking, project-based learning, and entrepreneurial pedagogy. Entrepreneurial pedagogy being where the purpose of learning is for young people to think like an entrepreneur, not necessarily that we want young people to be entrepreneurs. Over the last 12 months, Dan and I have then worked to build this into our own approach to pedagogy to capture the essence of the drivers that define our own learning design that sits both within our challenge and then also within the work that we do with schools as well. And so I'm not going to walk through all of these in a huge amount of detail, but what I will say is we've intentionally left the center, which would be the inner core, quite blank, because when we work with schools, the essence of the school would sit within this framework in the work that we do in classrooms. But you'll notice from the inner core, we have our outer core, which is our capability framework. And these are the 6 capabilities that we build through our curriculum. And then on the other side of that capability framework, we have our 6 pedagogical drivers or our pillars. And so those drivers are intentional design. So we draw from understanding by design frameworks to backward map curriculum from learning outcomes. And so again, if you jump on our website, you can unpack this a little bit further. The next element is authentic relevance. And this is that why factor, which I think is very important for young people today. And so this is drawing from gold standard PBL. If you're familiar with the Buck Institute, which has now sort of is PBL Works, but they're gold standard for project-based learning. Authenticity is a critical component of that pedagogy. And so this is where we're using driving questions and real-world links and case studies in order to bridge that connection between learning and life for young people. Our third pillar or driver is progressive complexity. This is the one that Dan and I probably wrestled with the longest to capture this notion of, we really believe that learning should build in productive friction. So students should be staged through challenge in a learning environment that allows them to sit at their growth edge within the confines of a safe learning space. And so we're talking about sequencing learning from surface learning through to deep and transfer, acknowledging that, the beginning of a unit, this is where some of the components of the science of learning are really critical, but then moving to a more open-ended inquiry once students have the knowledge base in order to apply, looking at that increased cognitive demand, and then for us, explicitly building what we call productive friction. Okay, this idea that young people will sit at their growth edge within learning experiences. The next driver is looking at capability development. I won't linger too long here because this is the part of our work that many of you will be familiar with, but deliberately weaving in target capabilities through curriculum. The next driver is action, and this notion of iterative assessment. And so those of you that are familiar with project-based learning, this idea of portfolio assessment and young people having what we would call learning peaks woven within curriculum. And so our curriculum design for our challenge this year has 3 portfolio tasks sitting within a 10-week unit of curriculum to give students this opportunity at iterative assessment and authentic mixed method assessment within the curriculum. And then finally, this idea of reflective transfer. And so the notion that learning can't transfer into the next environment if students are not given explicit opportunity to reflect. So obviously there's quite a bit there. What I wanted to do, I've done pretty well. I was 2 minutes over. I'm going to give myself a pat on the back for that. But just talk about the idea that really pedagogy is to bridge that gap between teacher expectations and student needs. I think just bring us back to the fact that this work is important for young people, because what we need to do is curate learning frameworks that enable young people the best chance to be successful within the classroom. And when we look at the challenges that we have with engagement, I firmly believe that the place to solve engagement is with pedagogy. And the last thing that I would say is our approach to pedagogy brings together our philosophical view on what we think is important in teaching and learning, and that approaches to pedagogy should reflect the unique contexts at which the schools are operating in and what their communities value. So I'll just surface again that today's about having open conversations and dialogues about the value of this work and being able to apply processes to your context, but not necessarily pick up products for your context.
Oh,
I'll put myself
well
on mute.
done, Nick. That wasn't so bad. In my head, I gave you another 5 minutes. Just, I'd expected it. I'm going to give you a little minute to read the chat. There's a question there from Rachel, which we might double back to. So thank you, Rachel, for adding that to the chat.
Trust Rachel to give me a curly question.
But there's also a really nice segue there from hearing about what we at Future Anything do believe in our approach, and some case studies of how the work has been enacted in other places. And so I'd love to dive over to Julie at Marryatville and maybe ask the question around how it all came together, Julie. So, as a high-performing public school, there were various existing frameworks in place for you. And what I'd love to know is, what made you realize there was value in bringing the work together, being more connected under a new pedagogical approach?
I guess around 2020 in South Australia, Year 7s entered high school rather than being in primary settings. And so we undertook that as an opportunity to kind of do a big curriculum review process. And that helped us define our core values. So we have had those very well established for quite some time. We really dug deeply with our community about the things that really mattered. So we had well established our values. And from that work, we also kind of defined 4 separate frameworks, which we thought were fantastic at the time. We had a curriculum framework, a pedagogy framework, a wellbeing and a community framework. And they gave us really strong clarity at that point in time around the directions and the things that, you know, were deeply important to us. And they kind of, you know, helped, I guess, teachers plan learning experiences that were targeted at engaging our young people. At the same time, the South Australian curriculum and the SACE landscape, so our senior curriculum in South Australia, were increasing their focus on capabilities and dispositions and learner agency, but much of the language and the implementation was still emerging, and it's still not yet really that clearly defined for schools. So we had our 4 frameworks. We had kind of the emerging directions in South Australia where there is focus on capabilities and dispositions. And I think when we first started to engage with Nick, we got them out proudly and said, look, we've got all of this stuff quite well defined. But what we realised, and it was quite a light bulb moment, I guess, for us, is that you can't separate into separate frameworks, curriculum and pedagogy. They're inextricably linked, as is wellbeing and that sense of community and connection. So that, I guess, prompted us in our work with Nick and Future Anything to sort of crystallise the thinking around needing to consolidate those frameworks into something, I guess, less cluttered and more centred around the learner experience being at the centre. And so we engaged in a range of staff workshops and leader workshops with some provocations. And it definitely became clear that simpler, more practical ways to help both staff and students understand what our core beliefs were in terms of what high quality practice looked like and what a high quality experience and an engaged experience looked like in the centre. So we spent quite a bit of time. As I said, our values were well entrenched, so that philosophy was well entrenched. Our school motto is thriving today, transforming tomorrow, and we didn't believe we needed to shift on that. We also didn't believe we needed to, you know, our values were really well entrenched. And then we looked at the plethora of versions of capabilities and language out there, and we very much do things at Marryatville by sticking to one set of consistent language, meta language that all staff and students use. And so I guess the capabilities framework, the Future Anything capabilities framework, jumped out at us as being quite simple, but also really well researched, and the elements were really well defined. And so we adopted as our outer core the Future Anything capabilities. And that really, I think, has given staff some clear kind of directions and some clear language to begin to look at their learning design and embedding opportunities for young people to understand and be able to articulate what those capabilities are, but B, also be able to, in the learning design, provide those opportunities for our learners. So the capabilities for us has been quite a huge shift. We're in our early days of building our staff's literacy around those capabilities and understanding, and we're deliberately going very slowly through that so that we develop that consistent understanding and consistent language. And then I think the hard work starts with teachers almost having to unlearn a way of designing learning and relearn. And I know Nick's been with us for a few professional learnings, and our teachers are great learners. They're very compliant. They'll sit and listen and nod. And then when we get to kind of really the hard work where it's undoing some ways of doing things, it becomes quite challenging. So, it's very exciting. Our staff are very ready for doing this work, but even with enthusiasm, it's actually quite slow and hard work. And so we're deliberately going very slowly about it.
Yeah, I love what you're saying there around building a shared language and getting consistency and doing it slow and making it sustainable. What I want to dive into is something you said around the learner experience. And I guess what I'd love to know is what are you hoping or what are you starting to see in this new approach that is making learning different for learners? What might be more visible or intentional than it was before?
I think being really upfront with our learners about that teachers are looking to design learning differently, and our learners are obviously very compliant. Traditionally, have been very happy to get the assessment exemplar and follow the bouncing ball. They haven't been comfortable struggling. Their parents often are not comfortable with them struggling, and so will helicopter in and look to save them. So being clearly articulating that we're being quite deliberate in putting our young people into situations where they might have to think or talk their way through an experience and feel a bit unsettled and not know all the answers and work out what to do when they don't know what to do. Being quite upfront with our parents in that narrative and being quite upfront with our students, I guess, is where we're starting. We're starting some of that work, particularly with our student leaders, to get their feedback. And because it's not a great space, kids are still very focused on the end point of assessment. So being back in that struggle space is something quite new and quite sometimes overwhelming for both staff and students.
Yeah, I love what you've said there around having to be a bit vulnerable in the space, and definitely that capability work is very much highlighted, yeah, in what you've said there. Thank you. Adam, I want to jump across to you and talk about the work at BBC. And look, I know that this is still very early stages in the process at BBC, but it's been very intentionally collaborative. And I guess I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what led you to the approach of developing the new pedagogical framework and this element of co-design.
Yeah, so I guess probably a couple of years ago, we had a PED framework that was very theory heavy. And I think as teachers, we probably struggled to connect the theory into practice a little bit. And we probably recognized an opportunity to bring together a new framework and develop a greater coherence and shared understanding about what we truly valued in teaching and learning within our context. So I guess we had examples of excellent teaching practice across the school and pockets of great work across the school. But we wanted to really bring that together and formulate a new PED framework that was, I guess, driven from the middle and driven by the staff themselves, who are the ones on the ground implementing the work as they go. So, and that's not necessarily about removing teacher autonomy either. It was more about developing those values and principles and signature practices that we as a collective staff agree support students in our context to engage the best. And the co-design was really important because we wanted to develop a framework that was truly reflective of the practice and the staff that we had here at the school. But we also wanted staff to be able to see themselves within that framework, whilst also being, I guess, aspirational and looking to stretch and challenge staff pedagogy as well. But the co-design was really important, obviously, for buy-in purposes, for ownership, which then translates into practice as well. And I guess with any change process, we didn't want it to be seen as something that's been imposed top down, but rather something that has been led from the middle, and that a large number of staff have had some ownership of as we've gone through the process. So initially, at the start of 2024, we sat down and looked at, as a whole staff, we looked at a number of different frameworks from across schools, close by, and looked at what do we value most in terms of pedagogy, what do our students need, and really we looked to share practice there, and we came up with a whole range of information around what we truly valued in teaching and learning and what we believed best practice was for our students. And from there, we've had upwards of 60 staff engaged regularly with the process, in developing, I guess, initial prototyped frameworks to then presenting that back to whole staff and so forth. And, now we're at a stage where we're really fleshing out the work within each of those pillars and building those practical toolkits and signature practices that teachers can then take away, implement in the classroom and see themselves working within our framework, if that makes sense. So that work's still ongoing throughout this year, and it's been planned over a number of years on purpose. We don't want to, as Julie said before, it's not something we want to roll out really quickly. We want to make sure we get it right, and that teachers have had their say. But yeah, I guess a major part of the work has been thinking more about how we can more intentionally engage students in the learning and the learning process itself, and that's been a big part of the work. We've ended up with, we've ended up with 5 sort of key pillars that we think will engage our learners in an authentic way. And as you said before, we've established working groups to work on each pillar at the moment and really establish the practices that would be reflective of each of those pillars in the classrooms. And while we still want teachers to have that contextual responsiveness to the students they have in front of them, and I guess a key part of that is through the development of those signature practices, creating variations in those elements as well, for different year levels and subjects and whatever else. So it's been great. The co-design, I think, has really been positive in that the language around our pedagogy and the dialogue that's going on between staff at the moment is great. So yeah.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I love the way you spoke about getting your inner core right and really focused on what you wanted in your school and taking time to move through that process, and then the buy-in that's had for staff who want to be part of these working parties for your pillars. I guess one of the questions that I'd love to add, Adam, here is, your school has really strong leadership. You have lots of expertise that sit in your leadership and across your staff. But this work could be done internally, but you've chosen to partner externally with somebody in this work. And I guess my question would be, what value does an external perspective or a partnership bring in leading pedagogical change like this?
Yeah, well, I guess a fresh perspective for one. I think sometimes, when you're deeply immersed in your own culture, it's hard to take a step back and challenge assumptions and also, think more strategically in a broader sense. But also that intentional facilitation as well has been really strong for our staff. And it's allowed for our staff to engage openly and freely without, I guess, that pressure. And, yourself and Nick have really provided the bus, if you will, but haven't necessarily driven us in any direction. It's truly been our staff that have driven that bus, and has never felt like it's been something that's been done to us. It's genuinely felt collaborative in nature between Future Anything and ourselves. So I think the external partnership has allowed us to really have a structured process in which we've followed, which I have truly valued, and I know our staff have got a lot out of it as well. But it's been a great process that has allowed us to sort of go in a direction, as Nick said before, that we think would best suit our context that we have here at Brisbane Boys College.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I love what you said there around that you feel like your school and your staff are still driving the bus, which is really cool. And there is value in an external partnership, whoever that might be, to support this work. Julie, was there anything that you can add to that same question?
I think for us, one of the things that our framework has now brought, A, is common language, B, is generated by staff. So, we really believe that our 4 pillars reflect what our staff have collaboratively arrived at in terms of, what constitutes, and it's kept the focus on the learner experience. But for us, I think one of the biggest benefits has been the coherence. So we have some well-established kind of strategic pieces of work that we're doing. For example, we've had a big focus on oracy. We've also had, the focus on capabilities. We've had a focus on high quality teacher practices. And so being able to build a coherent picture that shows that each of those, I guess, toolkits that we've developed that teachers can kind of, pull out when the time is right in a particular piece of learning, showing that all of those can run alongside of each other and all contribute to activating our young people to be more present and engaged in the learning that they're doing. So, for example, our use of oracy really builds young people's capacity to talk their way through a problem or to engage collaboratively, in a learning activity. Our work in terms of, capabilities, giving them language, where, again, as I said, in our infancy, but by giving them language to talk about some of their actions, some of their thoughts, some of their beliefs, some of the evidence that they might be collecting along the way in their learning journey, by giving them common language and some rubrics to look at and make some judgments about their growth. All of those things are activating them in the learning experience. I think, that for us, the product is learner agency. And so being able to, I guess, share and bring that together in a coherent way, the signature practices support us to activate the rest of our framework. So
yeah, love that. And those of you familiar with our work will know that we talk about when young people can wield capabilities and the pedagogy that your signature practices is developing. That's what really drives student agency. Now, I know, Nick, you've promised some answers to some questions in the chat. So I'm going to throw
I thought I was going to get away with not answering Rachel's question. No, I'm kidding. All right, so Rachel's question was, what do you think are the pressures or structures that keep teachers positioned as the expert in the room rather than allowing students to become more active producers of learning? I think it's teachers' uncomfortableness with the productive friction required to sit in ambiguous learning environments, okay? Because if I'm at the front of the room, I'm in control. And so as soon as I shift pedagogically to open up space for young people to control learning, then I'm relinquishing control. And so this is why the work has to start with your teachers. And one thing that Julie and Adam spoke to, but maybe didn't express clearly enough, is the level of deep consultation that both leaders have done across all subsets of their community, including students, including teachers, and the investment they've made in capacity building. So almost every single one of their student-free days and professional learning days have had some degree of focus on this framework and building teachers' confidence to sit in maybe uncomfortable pedagogies that they're not fluent in, okay? Because let's also talk about the fact that for most school contexts, teachers' success is measured by the success of their students. And so when you control the learning environment by disseminating content that students regurgitate back to you in the same fashion, you're increasing the likelihood of your students being successful, but also you being successful. When we start to play with more progressive pedagogies that relinquish some of that teacher control to students, we also relinquish maybe some of the certainty around what the results of the students will look like. And so there's genuine risk-taking that happens by professionals in their pedagogical approach when that happens. And so what we also need to talk about here is if you want to shift pedagogical approaches in your school, the first thing you have to build is trust, and also a sense of comfortableness that if teachers take pedagogical risk, they're not going to be hauled over the coals or called in for questioning, or, there's not going to be repercussions if results look a little bit different while both teachers and students are learning to navigate the shift from teacher-controlled pedagogies to student agency. Okay, so that takes a little bit of time. Does that answer the question, Rach?
Yeah, that was unreal. Thanks, Nick. That's top. Appreciate that.
Tom, love it. So love the idea of pedagogy being fluid for school context, very important, and more specifically each class. But I'm curious, how does this translate to each individual learner, especially if each student has a different learning style? I think that's a really interesting question. And this is where I would say that irrespective of the approach to pedagogy or PED framework or teaching and learning framework that a school has, the way that that framework lives within a learning environment is that contextual application that an educator makes in the room. And so this is why we talk about signature practice, but they're not rule books to be followed explicitly. They become buckets of practice that teachers will choose from in order to meet the needs of the learners that are in front of them. And so the core needs to be, the secret sauce of teaching is walking into a classroom, understanding your learners, and then adjusting pedagogical practice to meet the needs of the learners in front of you. And so none of this is an instruction manual. And our greatest fear, both Dan and I, and I think I echo Julie and Adam in this, we're not looking for cookie cutter learning to be happening in classrooms. But what we're looking to do is to build a signature essence of what great practice is in our schools, and then coach teachers with the capacity building to wield those pedagogical drivers with proficiency. And so that's in providing both capacity building in the sense of professional learning, and then toolkits and supports that will allow both a beginning teacher and a very proficient expert teacher to experiment with both the default pedagogies that they feel strong in and perhaps some new pedagogies that might feel a little bit uncomfortable at the same time. But really the lens is, when I walk into the classroom, I know my learners so well that I can wield signature practice with intention to meet the needs of the learners that are in front of you.
Wow, we could talk about this all day. Like,
I love these sessions. Let's stay forever.
We are very open to being able to expand on any questions that you have or unpack any of this further. So please reach out at any time and chat to us around anything else you'd love to know. But we have raced through 45 minutes. And so I'd like to really, really genuinely thank Adam and Julie and Nick for being with us this afternoon to talk about the work, to talk about what is changing for young people as a result of the work. And we can hear the passion and the excitement and the enthusiasm come through those case studies, which is really amazing. Last question before we completely switch off for this afternoon is what's on the reading list or the podcast list, or what's something you've come across recently that you can share? Nick's always got something. I'm going to go to Nick first and give Adam and Julie some thinking time.
Oh, I'm in such a deep fantasy hole at the moment that I'm actually feel like any professional credibility I've built in this session will be completely dismantled by sharing the books that I read on my plane trip. So which is unlike me, going to decline.
Well, that is a first for me, but I love that. Adam, anything that you're reading or listening to? One thing I've just finished reading, actually. It's not a new book, but I'm obviously a big sports fan, ex-PE background as well, or still PE background, I should say. But The Score Takes Care of Itself by Bill Walsh, who's an ex-49ers coach in the NFL. It's more about leadership systems and process and getting the process right before the outcome. So, yeah, something that was interesting to me.
I love that. I have not heard of that, but that sounds like it's something I'd be interested in too. Awesome. Thank you. Julie?
We have been engaging with some of the work by Ron Richard, the Cultures of Thinking work. And I think, something that really resonated with me is just his first, culture of thinking. For us to have a culture of thinking for students and have them, actively engaged, we actually have to create that environment for our teachers. And so, making sure that they're not just passive vessels as well, that they're kind of active in the learning that we set up for them. His work's really interesting. There's 10 transformative mindsets that I think really are fantastic, just to remind school leaders about the work that we do and that we need to kind of activate our teachers too.
Yeah, I love that. Would 100% support that as well. I've read into his work and it's really fantastic. Well, that's it, everybody. Thank you so much to Julie and Adam and Nick for being on board. Thank you to you for joining us this afternoon. We will send out a post-session email with a whole bunch of the resources and, of course, the recording. And we can't wait to see you again for our next live learning. We'll be back in June. But for this afternoon, thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your evening and take care. Thanks.